Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shockley Martin, and I am the founder and a member of the board of directors for the Chisholm Leadership Academy. I'm excited to welcome you this evening. For those of you that are new to our organization, we are a Georgia-based nonprofit that leverages civic education and mentorship to prepare girls across our state, so across Georgia and the country, to become public service leaders and zealous advocates. We hope that tonight's discussion will enhance your understanding of the criminal justice system through the lenses of experienced women leaders. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that for many of us, this has been an incredibly difficult week. I know that many of you may be joining this town hall feeling outraged, frustrated, tired, disheartened, and even a little bit afraid. Like all of the forums that our organization cultivates, we hope that this will be a safe space and an opportunity to respectfully delve into complex issues and to unapologetically share unfiltered experiences. While our organization doesn't endorse candidates or adopt a policy platform, I hope that we can come to a few agreements. The first is that justice, real justice, demands fairness, equity, transparency, and accountability. The other agreement that I hope that we can find tonight is that we share a belief that Breonna Taylor, Tatiana Jefferson, Sandra Bland, and so many other Black and brown people, many of them cisgendered women, transgendered women and femmes, whose names we will never know, were invaluable. If you're here because you don't know anything about the criminal justice system, its impact on girls, women, and femmes of color, and why having women of color in leadership is important, then this is the forum for you. If you're knowledgeable, currently work or have worked to reform the system, thank you for your passion and for your service. We know that this conversation will be equally enriching for you. We want to hear from you, so please use the chat feature in the bottom bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen to engage other participants, to engage the panelists. We're also going to open up for audience Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the session, so keep your questions ready for that. You can submit them online using the Q&A feature. And if you want to share nuggets from the conversation online, you can do so using the hashtag CLA, like Chisholm Leadership Academy, CJ, like Criminal Justice Reform. Again, that's hashtag CLA CJ Reform, or you can tag CLA at Chisholm Leaders or the United States of Women at USOW Women, spelled out, or any of our featured speakers. We've shared their handles in the confirmation email. Before I turn it over to my fellow board member, Judge Verda Colvin, I want to thank the United States of Women for serving as a partner in this effort. You'll hear from Gabriella Cristobal and Jordan Brooks in just a moment. I want to thank each of our speakers for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to join us. And I want to thank each of you. You're here on a Thursday evening because you are passionate about these issues. You are committed to reform. And so I want to thank you for being here this evening and for taking the first step in helping to reform the system. Have a great night.
Good evening and welcome. I want to start off by just making a few comments regarding women as leaders. In my mind, it's vital, it's necessary, it is paramount that each of us take on the role of a leadership role in the criminal justice system. Women of color should take on these roles. And one reason why is because they particularly have an insight that is unique. Based upon their personal experiences, their life experiences, and understanding of communities of color, they bring a perspective that is unique and is vital. It's not only vital for people within communities of color, but for society as a whole. Having women of color in leadership positions ensures that people not only have the reality of having someone who understands their plight and who will ensure that justice, fairness, and integrity takes place, but it also gives the perception of fairness. And perception, as they say, is reality. And so seeing women of color in leadership positions ensures those in those communities that they can get a sense of fairness, that there will be accountability. And so that's important. That also leads to the aspect of recognizing the impact of disparities in communities of color as it relates to the criminal justice system. We know, and data shows, that policies, procedures, sentencing, law enforcement, and decision-making are vital as it affects these communities. And so women of color in these leadership roles can recognize that on a much broader scale. And so tonight, the Chisholm Leadership Academy is honored to partner with the United States of Women for this riveting discussion. The panelists that you will have will be exciting. And at this time, I'd like to now introduce Ms. Jordan Brooks and Ms. Gabriella Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Calden. And I want to start by first thanking the incredible Ashlyn Martin, who is an ambassador at the United States of Women. And we are so lucky and honored to be in this work with her, and so proud of all of the work that she does across the state of Georgia every day. We at the United States of Women are, our mission really is to connect, convene, and amplify the work of women and girls around the country. And so we are so honored to partner with the Chisholm Leadership Academy today for what is an incredibly important conversation, especially right now. I think, we have really we know that women, and especially women of color, have always been in their communities, and especially during this crisis of the COVID-19 crisis, we are seeing women leading all across this country and really around the world. But also on this topic of criminal justice reform, women and women of color especially are the ones that have been leading the way. And so we're really excited to be partnering with the Chisholm Leadership Academy to be hearing from all of these incredible leaders who are role models for so many, myself included, in this country. And we are so honored to be a part of this work with you all. At the United States of Women, we are here to support what you're doing. We are here to amplify what you're doing. And we're here to partner with you on the work to take action in communities across the country. And so anything that any of you are doing, we would love to hear about it. We want to continue working with all of you. So please reach out to us and make sure that we can help amplify the work that you're already doing in your communities. So thank you so much to the Chisholm Leadership Academy. Thank you so much to all of our incredible panelists that you'll hear tonight. And thank you especially to Ashlyn and to Judge Calvin for all of your work. I'm going to turn it over to Gabriella to give us a little more.
Thank you, Jordan. I just want to echo everything that you just said and how honored we are to support and partner on this event. It is one of the joys of my job to get to work with Ashlyn and the other ambassadors, and she truly is an amazing representation of all of the work that you all are doing, and we want to continue working alongside each and every one of you and Ashlyn, and I'm so excited to listen to the insightful conversation that's going to happen tonight, that unfortunately is at such a timely point for us. And I know that the mission of the Chisholm Leadership Academy is to continue to increase visibility of not only these issues, but of a generation of really strong, phenomenal women leaders. And so that is what tonight is all about. And we are truly just honored to be in partnership and to continue to support this work. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yasmin Neal, and I'm a board member and also the chair of the Outreach and Strategic Partnerships Committee for the Chisholm Leadership Academy. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you to our esteemed panel. And I will start with the introduction of the panelists. To begin, we have Justice Raquel Montoya-Lewis of the Washington Supreme Court. We have Judge Cassandra Kirk, Chief Magistrate Judge, Fulton County Court Administration, Magistrate Court of Fulton County. We have Nicole Porter, Director of Advocacy of the Sentencing Project. We have the Honorable Sherry Boston, DeKalb County District Attorney. We have the Honorable Kim Foxx, who will be joining us later, Cook County State's Attorney. And we also have the Honorable Marilyn Mosby, State's Attorney for Baltimore City. Welcome, lady. It's an honor to have you here, and we will jump right into it for time's sake. We will start from the beginning. Tell us about your life at the age of 14. What were your interests and who inspired you? This question is for everyone, but I'm going to start with Justice Montoya-Lewis.
Hi, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. 14 was a long time ago for me, but when I was 14, I really had a lot of questions about what my future would look like. My parents really emphasized the importance of going to college, and that was a value that I grew up with, but I certainly didn't have a particular plan about where I was going to be. And the more I reflect on that, the more I think that was related to really not having people out there, women out there that had lives like mine, that came from backgrounds like mine. And so that was somewhat of a challenge to find individual sort of people that were inspirational to me. But I will say that my father and his life was something that was sort of a touchstone for me throughout my life, and certainly through my childhood. He was in the military as a U.S. Air Force officer, and he was pretty routinely the only Native American person in the room through most of his career, often the only person of color in the room. And he was pretty emphatic about the importance of the work that I did, whatever it was. And he said, you're going to have to work 3 times as hard to get the same recognition as other folks. And that was something that both pushed me and inspired me to continue working hard.
Thank you. Judge Cassandra Kirk.
Hi, and so I wanted to show you me at 14. I'm going to step out of the way for just a hot second so you can see me at 14. I actually went to go find my high school yearbook picture. This is, well, hold on, let me show you. Right, yay. This was me at 14. At 14, I was obviously a 9th grader at high school, at Briarcliff High School. I was part of an M2M program. I'm going to take my picture down now. And one of the things, I apologize, one of the things that being in the M2M program allowed me to do was to absolutely and authentically be myself. No one knew what that should look like. And so for a lot of people, it was their first encounter with people of color. And so I got to be on the drill team. I got to march Spirit of Atlanta. I got to be in gymnastics. I was on the student council. I was in Latin club. I was in Latin National Honor Society. I'm a huge nerd. And so being at a DeKalb County public school in my 9th grade year allowed me really to be me. Next door to me were the Scotts, Tom and Jackie Scott, who were involved in political office. So as far as I can remember, I remember being out at the State House and the State Senate, I remember paging in like 5th and 6th grade. So for me, I have always been some attachment to politics. My dad was very active in NAACP, was very active in voter registration back in the 60s. So we have always been very aware of our voice and the need to use it. And who inspired me was just my parents. I was very, very impressed that they came from Mississippi and that they worked so very hard to drop me in the middle of a place where I was one of few Black students. And I think they believed that that was the best at the time. And I have turned out all right. It has been a struggle at times, but I believe that those were the people that inspired me most.
Very nice, thank you. And Nicole Porter.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for including me on this panel. Very honored to be here with you all this evening. So at 14, I was a freshman as well, obviously. I think probably all of us were in the high school in Houston, Texas. And I would say women of color, Black women that inspired me being from Houston, Barbara Jordan. I grew up learning about Barbara Jordan. I live in Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee's district, where I grew up in her district. I live in DC now, and my mother still resides in her district. So my youth was certainly shaped by influential Black women who were in leadership positions and who were in elected office. And so, that's certainly something that's driven me over time. And as a high school student, I was one of 3 young Black girls in my freshman class. And so I think being one of a handful of Black girls in my freshman class sort of inspired me to be in it and helped to motivate and influence my interest in speaking up and speaking out for myself and in developing arguments to make my case range of issues, including advocacy work that I'm doing now.
Nice. And next we have the Honorable Sherry Boston.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I'm just so happy to be on this panel with these amazing women, some of which I get to call my closest friends, so it's fabulous. Having said that, at 14, I was a freshman in high school. I think just kind of reflecting on the question and you know, particularly women in leadership and African-American women in leadership, I can honestly say that my biggest role models were my mothers, my aunts, and my grandmothers, because they were the only women of color that I saw in my community. You know, I grew up in Baltimore where, you know, my friend Marilyn is the state's attorney. And at that time, you know, there were African Americans in leadership, but they were men. It was before a time where we saw particularly African American women in leadership roles. So you didn't see that. And I went to a school where, you know, I was the only African American girl at my school for 6th grade and 7th grade. And then by the time 8th grade rolled around, we had one more. And by the time we got to 9th grade, we had 10, which for some seemed like, you know, a big deal. One other woman that I would count and to this day is still very much in my life, was my 6th grade math teacher, Mrs. Roberson, who was the only African-American teacher at my school for 7 years, the entire time I was there. And she was definitely someone that was a role model for me, because as a young Black girl in an all-white girls' school, to have a teacher that was like a mom, that looked out for me, that even when I was no longer her 6th grade math student, she followed me all the way through high school, which was on the same grounds. And like I said, to this day, you know, she texted me last week. She has been in my life my entire life. And so, you know, I only wish that she were on here to hear me say how much she had a role in shaping who I am, just by being an educator in my life that cared about the success of another young Black girl, knowing how difficult that could be in the environment when you are the only face of color in a school full of people that don't look like you and teachers that don't look like you. So I'm really glad to have had an educator be a part of shaping my life, and my family being a part of the strong women in my family who really shaped my life.
Very nice. I'm definitely hearing a pattern. And of course, you can send this to her when we finish, and so she can watch the recording. And next, we have the Honorable Kim Foxx.
Thank you for having me, and what a wonderful panel to be a part of. I wish I was as brave as the judge to show a picture of me when I was 14. Let's just say the glow up is real. You're just gonna have to imagine it. Just imagine it, just hot, skinny mess. Thank you for having me. The pattern will continue. You know, when I was 14, I was raised, my mom was a single parent who was 18 when she had me, 17 when she had my brother, and dropped out of high school when she was pregnant with me. And really, you know, over the years, I watched her suffer and struggle to try to make an opportunity for my brother and I so that we could go to the best schools and have opportunities that were outside of her grasp. Not that she didn't have talent. My mother was one of the smartest people I had ever known, but the opportunity wasn't there. My grandmother, because my mother was such a young parent, was also like a co-parent to me. And my grandmother grew up in the South and migrated to Chicago and left high school when she was in the 9th grade. So when she was 14, to come to Chicago. And so I had these women who were not themselves gone through the education system and gotten degrees, but who were fiercely advocating for me to be able to get an education, to be able to learn how to play an instrument. I played my freshman year of high school, the French horn. And because my grandmother thought it was a beautiful looking instrument, she didn't have to get on the bus with a big French horn, but she thought that like me knowing the French horn and having that, my mother encouraged me. I went to a language academy to take Spanish so that I could be fluent in another language. All things that they didn't have the ability to have, that they believed that I was entitled to. And I watched them struggle, whether it was from coming from Arkansas or the projects of Chicago, and really pour into me everything that I needed to be able to excel. They were my role models every single day. They taught me both toughness and humility. They taught me that no matter your station in life, there was something to contribute. That no matter how far you got, you don't put on airs. You remember from whence you came. All lessons that every single day that I carry with me. And so it is. I have the pleasure of parenting a set of 14-year-old girls right now. And every day I draw on the lessons that I learned from those who raised me. And now that I'm on the other side, now that I'm the mother of 14-year-old girls, I will acknowledge that there were times where I thought my mother had no idea what she was talking about. And then, as my grandmother would say, keep living. And then I lived and was like, oh my gosh, she was right. Then now when these kids are like, you have no idea. And for real, for some of it, I don't know what it's like to be 14 in the world of social media, 14 in the land of COVID right now. My two girls just lost out on their graduation because of social distancing. But I draw on the struggles of my grandmother having been raised by a sharecropper and the denial of opportunity to help teach the lessons that we can learn from today. And so even though it's a pattern, I think it's a pattern for a reason, that the women who came before us, who were intimately proximate to us, have so much to teach us.
Definitely nice. And lastly, the Honorable Marilyn Mosby.
Mute, Marilyn.
We got to bring her up.
All right, I got it. I didn't know if you guys had to do it or whether I had to do it.
Okay.
First and foremost, I want to send my condolences to the family of George Floyd, who had to watch their loved one killed on camera. I also want to send my condolences to all Americans. I think that when we're talking about leadership, and particularly Black women leadership right now in this moment, I think we're all grieving. When you consider time and time again, we're watching as our sons, our brothers, our fathers, our husbands are being murdered and being slaughtered in front of our eyes. It's a really, really difficult time. And so I wanted to just start that by sending my condolences to all that are dealing right now in a global pandemic with the inequities and the community police relations in America today. I then wanted to thank, the Chisholm Leadership Academy. I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am so honored to be on this panel with these beautifully, highly esteemed women. Some, as Sherry has already indicated, are my closest friends. So for me, what was life like at 14 years old? I want to say that life for me at 14 became a defining moment in my trajectory. I grew up like Kim. My mom was a single parent. She had me when she was 17 years old. And so my grandparents pretty much raised the two of us along with my uncles. But everybody in my family were police officers, right? My grandfather was one of the founding members of the first Black police organization in Massachusetts. My uncles, mother, my father, everybody were police officers. So that law enforcement was instilled. And when you grow up in an environment like that, my grandfather at the time, he epitomized a community police officer, didn't quite know it then, but you feel sheltered, you feel protected. And at 14 years old, my cousin, we have a very close-knit family. He lived right next door to me. We lived in a duplex. My grandparents lived right across the street. My cousin, he had aspirations of becoming an architect. I knew I wanted to be an attorney. I didn't know what type of attorney I wanted to be. And he was killed right outside of my home in broad daylight when he was mistaken as a neighborhood drug dealer. And so the reason why that kind of changed the trajectory of my life and it was a defining moment in my life because that was my first introduction to the criminal justice system. Couldn't understand going into the courtrooms and seeing the number of African Americans coming in and out in chains and shackles. Why wasn't anybody outraged? I didn't understand the system. What was the system? How do you reform it? How do you change it? The idea and that my cousin with all these dreams and all these aspirations was now going to a grave, but the individual responsible for his death was also 17 years old. I wondered how could we have gotten to that young man before he elected to take my cousin's life. So that for me is what sparked my, I guess, passion to reform the criminal justice system. It was at that moment in that courtroom that I realized, that awesome amount of power and discretion that prosecutors have. And so, that really began my journey. I think I tried to turn that painful, traumatizing event. I couldn't understand why we as the community were so complacent, right? We're seeing yet another African-American male, young boy shot dead in the streets. It was that sparked my interest in wanting to reform the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much for that. And that is the perfect lead-in to the meaty part of the discussion. Going into this part, the goal is to try to do maybe 2 minutes or so per question. Just try our best to be succinct, but pack as much good information into it as you can. And we're gonna jump right into it. So, and this question will be for anyone to jump in. For many youth, particularly in Black and Brown communities, schools have become an entry point for the criminal justice system. How do we ensure that schools are safe spaces for students and combat the disproportionate targeting of Black and Brown youth? Anyone can jump in. Don't all jump in at once.
One of the things that I think you're right about schools becoming an entry point for young people in the criminal justice system. And I think that prosecutors have the power to attempt to break that school to prison pipeline. When you look at the data, and just most recently, I guess the latest data that was put out, Department of Education in 2016, revealed that Black students are 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students. And so one of the things that I know that I've attempted to do in my office is to ensure that we're getting to young people before they get to the criminal justice system. Very much in line with that approach when I was 14 years old and saying, what could we have done to this young man? So we have a number of programs, at least out of my office, that have developed. I have a crime control and prevention division where we go into the schools once a month during the school year. It's our Great Expectations program, and we try to engage young people and show them the positive careers within the criminal justice system. You guys can remember when we had officer friendly in our schools, we had a rapport with law enforcement. That's in essence what we're trying to do in bringing in judges and defense attorneys and prosecutors. We have a program that we do every year where it's called our pop-ups, where between the hours of 6 and 9 on Friday nights, we try to keep young people productive and out of trouble. So we will pay for them to do laser tag and bowling and skating and provide food for them every Friday night throughout the summer. We have a junior state's attorney program where we try to engage young people and again, expose them to the criminal justice system. They start from the beginning of a criminal case in the 911 call center, evidence control room, Foxtrot, Federal Circuit District Court. At the culmination of the 6 weeks, we do a mock trial competition at the University of Baltimore School of Law. I think we do all of that because I think Frederick Douglass said it best. It's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. And so we have to be we have to take and do preventative measures, especially when it comes to young folks and before they actually get to that criminal justice system.
Let me just add that one of the ways to reform the criminal justice system is from outside of it. So I'm, very honored to be on this panel with judges and district attorneys and, many elected officials across the country. But as an advocate, one way to keep youth outside of the criminal justice system is to support community-based infrastructure that prevents arrest and interactions with law enforcement to begin with. And that's a role that advocates can play in raising up, practical examples of civic infrastructure that can be funded through public resources and public money to expand out community-based services in schools or in the local community to prevent those law enforcement interactions to begin with. That might look like funding after-school programs, mentorship programs, connecting at-risk youth to influential adults, supporting those relationships, either familial relationships or relationships with adults just in the community. There's a range of ways to support this, and those are also strategies that advocates can be organizing around and in partnership with elected leaders can work to fund fully so that youth don't come into contact with law enforcement at all.
So I want to add, as a former juvenile court judge, it was apparent those kids that scared us versus those kids that really just pissed off some teacher and ended up in our court system. And so for me, a part of this is, and I believe Judge Teskey here in Georgia attempted to lead a change in the juvenile system across the United States, particularly by asking that question and making those people, particularly law enforcement, before bringing a child into a system, to say, why is this child here? Is the child here because I'm mad, or is the child here because they've done something dangerous? And having law enforcement first be able to understand that question when I was a judge, that this is probably a child that needed some more support, whether that be support at home or support from our agency. It was always amazing to me how we watched kids come in. We watched these kids come in, and every person sitting in that courtroom that was a part of the system could tell this kid's failing school. This kid needs an educational ticket. This kid needs some mentoring, and not one system, not one piece of our system. Kid has bad health. Not one piece of our system was able to be brought on board to be able to support those kids. And so in looking at what we do holistically, it's got to start before we get them into the system. And I think Ms. Porter was correct when she was saying about what's happening in the community. If we can support communities as to figure out what the community needs, to figure out how to bolster those children in their community before they come into our systems, I believe is the best avenue for helping us break the school to prison pipeline.
Absolutely.
So I think we also have to change the conversation with our leaders around resources and where we are going to advocate funds. I think, I always, people tend to ask, what are the things that keep you up at night, or what are the most difficult cases that you see as a district attorney? And for me, it is where in Georgia, we call them SB 440s. It's a case where we have a young person, a juvenile, a child, charged with a capital offense, and what we call the 7 deadly sins, because those are cases where a child has entered the adult criminal system and is charged with some of the most heinous crimes, to include murder. And we have to reinvest our resources back into our children. In education, in healthcare, in developing who they are, not when they get to school, but before they get to school. Because I can tell you, and I require my staff to give me, I review every single case where we have a child that is being alleged to be charged as an adult. And we have great public defenders on my circuit that provide great reports, and every report starts the same. And it starts before most of these children have ever made a choice. So many of these reports I'm reading about things that are happening to them, trauma that is happening to them at 3, 4, and 5 years old, before they've even stepped foot in the school system, that are absolutely projecting and affecting how they are growing up and how they are perceiving the world around them. And so I do think we have to talk more about the conversation around trauma, because childhood trauma is connected to almost everyone that we're seeing coming in the criminal justice system. There is childhood trauma associated with that. And if we don't start addressing those issues and figure out how we can pour our resources and our money and our education and time into figuring out how we can help children that are in need before they ever even get to school, we are going to be having the same conversation. And we need to convince our leaders that spending money to house, incarcerate, and imprison children, if we took that money and invested in counseling and services and training for our children before they even got there, we would see much greater and different outcomes.
Just quickly before we go, I want to concur with everything that I've heard. I think part of the reason that we have seen the pipeline even bigger is that the point that the judge made, there are some kids who have special needs and attention that we need to really focus. But I've seen I was a juvenile court prosecutor supervisor for years, where the kids who had discipline issues were being criminalized. And we have to stop criminalizing juvenile behavior, right? There's a difference between criminal conduct that is fueled by trauma and all those things, and kids being kids. I have 4 teenage girls. I talked about the 2 14-year-olds. I have 4 teenage girls here teenagers do things that get on your absolute nerve, and you can tell them don't do that, and then they'll do it again. And they're not criminals, they're teenagers. And I think for a really long time, the lines got blurred between criminality and juvenile behavior. And that, particularly in communities of color and African-American communities, we saw it, a lot with young boys. Then we started to see it with girls, where, when I was coming up, if 2 people got into a fight at school, that, maybe you got a in-school suspension. We've now seen a rise in out-of-school suspensions for things that kids do. Kids fight. I break up something at least twice a week around here, and then they make up. But what happens is we have become over-reliant on calling the police and making arrests for that school fight without an appreciation for what the moment you put handcuffs on kids for being kids, the moment you dip their finger into that ink that you're going to put on to catch their fingerprints, it's over. It's over. We know the younger that kids have contact with the justice system, the more likely they are to be entangled with the system years later. And so we have to stop reflexively using the muscle of the criminal justice system to deal with juvenile teenage behavior. And I think that's where you've seen the explosion. Kids who are, talking back to teachers. We want calm courtrooms where kids can learn, but is there a resource in the school to deal with discipline without having to call the police? And what we find is schools with resources and have that appreciation don't make those calls. In Chicago and Cook County, where I live, it is the most under-resourced and underfunded schools that we see those calls being made. If we invested in peer juries and restorative justice programming in the schools, not facilitated by the justice system, where people can resolve those issues in-house and not call the police, I think we'd see a reduction. One of the things that we did was we met with our school superintendent. We went over their school code of conduct and talked about where they said they would call the police, and said, don't call us for that. We're not gonna prosecute that. Don't even waste your time. And saw a dramatic reduction in a number of those cases that came. because those are school discipline issues, not criminal justice issues. And so we have to make sure that we're able to delineate the two.
And that steps into our next question. So historically, the relationship between people of color and law enforcement has been contentious. What does an ideal community policing model look like? How do we ensure that all citizens feel safe and rebuild trust in law enforcement? This question's for everyone.
I'll jump in. Right, you got picking people. We are a polite group of folks here, and know that everyone has a wealth of information to share. So just start picking folks. But I will go quickly, and I think what we know, I don't starting with what does healthy community policing looks like. I think what does healthy communities look like in the neighborhoods where we see the least amount of violence. They're the same neighborhoods that have well-funded schools, that have education or economic opportunities, that have access to health care and groceries and the like. Those neighborhoods tend to have less crime and also have less policing. And so I think we should start with the narrative of what does healthy communities need versus what does policing need to look in their health and safety and welfare. So we start with that. Then from there, it is, I grew up in public housing, and one of the things that I saw is stuff happened in the building. People in the building used to take care of that, right? Like you didn't call police because you didn't know what the response was going to be. So something went down, somebody knew about it, maybe two families worked it out some kind of way. And however that might have been, but it was worked out within community. And so what it has always taught me is that the resources to help what the community needs lies in community. And so I think from a policing standpoint, we have to start with the premise that people aren't coming in there to save us. We're not asking for people to come in and be heroes. Like this notion of the heroic savior to communities that often drives a lot of that engagement is troublesome. And so I think a healthy model looks like, how do we give the people and communities the resources that they need, that we are a support or a last resort, and not an occupying paternalistic presence where we believe that the people who are there have the answers and want to be supportive of their answers. But you don't build trust until you show yourself worthy of doing that. And I think you do that by owning mistakes, owning harm that has been caused, and actively working to fix that harm without asking for anything in return.
I just will add to that I've worked in a number of communities. I was a tribal court judge for 15 years and worked in communities both in the Pacific Northwest and in the Southwest that have experienced centuries of oppressive tactics from the federal government, from the police, from all of these, from schools, from all of these various institutions that we're told to trust. And it's been my experience that until those institutions begin to acknowledge the role that they play in terms of breaking that trust and creating and causing trauma in those communities, there's really no conversation to be had about how to build bridges between the people and, in this case, in terms of your question, the police. And I think I agree with what Ms. Foxx was saying with regard to building healthy communities. And I think part of a healthy community is a community that trusts its institutions. And I think until you start to see those institutions do the hard work, and it is hard work, to understand their own biases and how that plays in to the things that they're actually doing in their day-to-day work and what that means as an institution, I don't know that there's really much of a conversation. On this side of the fence, you can't really do that work if you know, if the people that you're sort of trying to target are not interested in participating in those hard conversations. And I just think, particularly when you're talking about police as a whole, you know, until you really, I think until the communities that I've worked with really see, you know, consistent and sincere and proactive engagement in their own racism and their own involvement in systemic oppression, I don't know how that moves forward. And so I think that we really have to be honest about what those expectations have to be.
I would say, and I agree with both of my colleagues, I would just note that we know what community policing is not, right? Community policing is not what we've been seeing in the George Floyd case. Community policing is not what happened in Freddie Gray, the untimely death of that young man. Community policing is definitely not the 183-page report that described the pattern and practices of discriminatory enforcement against poor Black and brown people in the city of Baltimore. Community policing is definitely not, you know, planting guns and drugs on residents for years and selling and redistributing guns and drugs as a special elite police force. So I guess when asked that question, I think it's really difficult for people to empathize with others if they've never had to. And so I think that's what we're dealing with, at least here in the city of Baltimore. I think at one point it was about 83% of our police department did not live in the city of Baltimore, right? So when you have communities and police officers that are policing communities that they're not necessarily from, and they don't have a shared sort of life experience, it's really difficult to try to have an expectation that they're going to be able to empathize or to recognize their implicit biases. So when you ask, what does it look like, you know, as I reflect, you know, growing up in a police house, what community policing looks like. And it didn't really dawn on me until about 3 years ago when I was running for re-election, and I happened to be in a coffee shop. And it's crazy because growing up in the so-called police house, it was annoying to me because every time I came home, there was some stranger in my house talking about, hey, cuz, how you doing, sis? And I'm like, I don't know you, right? Like, who are you? And I didn't understand why my grandparents constantly had people in our house. Like the boy from down the street, the knucklehead that just got in trouble. I never got that. And so, you know, it was frustrating in law school when they had karaoke every night on Saturdays until 4 in the morning, but I digress. But when I was in that coffee shop 3 years ago, you know, this young man walked up to me and was like, hey, are you Marilyn Mosby? I said, yeah, I am. He said, I just want to thank you. I said, thank me for what? He said, I want to thank you for Mr. T. Mr. T was my grandfather. He said, you know, I would not be the man that I am today if it wasn't for your grandfather. And it dawned on me, right? Like all those times that those individuals, one, my grandfather was a police officer in the height of racism, right? That in and of itself was difficult. But he was bringing all those young people into our homes and being there to be that example for the community in ways in which I didn't appreciate then, but I clearly understand that he epitomized what community policing is all about.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. So I definitely want to look forward to the feedback from the district attorneys in the room. And I definitely want to hear back from Nicole as well. So about the impact of plea bargains and prosecutorial discretion. An October 2017 study done by Professor Carlos Verdero of Loyola Law School found that prosecutors may subconsciously rely on race when evaluating whether or not defendants are likely to commit crimes in the future. Other studies have found that implicit bias impacts how individuals are treated at every step of the criminal justice process. How do we mitigate the role that implicit bias plays in plea bargaining and sentencing? Is it possible to ensure that criminal justice is race neutral? I'm jumping right in. Sherry Boston.
Yeah, so what I would say is that as an elected prosecutor, I saw it as my role and responsibility to address implicit bias, because it absolutely plays a role in how those of us in the criminal justice system handle our cases, whether it's sentencing, plea bargaining, or just how we evaluate the facts and circumstances of how something happened. And so the first thing you do is you have to acknowledge that it exists. And then you have to figure out what's the best way for me to combat a bias that exists in everyone. And for me in Georgia, it was about training. And so I was definitely inspired by Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Attorney General Eric Holder and what they'd done on the federal side when they were running the DOJ. And so one of my top priorities when I became DA was I said everyone in my office is going to get implicit bias training. And by everyone, I just mean the prosecutors. It was the victim advocates, the investigators, down to the receptionists at the front window that engage with the public. So last year, we became the only district attorney's office in the state of Georgia that required every single one of their employees to go through 8 hours of implicit bias training. And it has been a successful marker for us because it allows us to have real conversations about the things that we see and how it impacts what we do. And for me, it was continuing. I didn't want this to be a standalone thing that the people in my office that happened to work there during that time period where we did this training would get this training. And so we also implemented an ongoing contract. And so every year, the training is redone, and every employee that is new to the office and has not gone through it is required. And then we open up if we have spots for anybody else that feels like they want to go through our training. And so if we aren't addressing the fact that implicit bias is inherent in our system, if we aren't addressing the fact that our system was built and created out of systemic racism, then we can't address the issues. So we've got to acknowledge, we've got to accept, and then we've got to problem solve.
If I could add, I think one of the opportunities about the moment we're in now is that we have officials who can use their authority to repair the harms related to mass incarceration. So at the Sentencing Project, we launched at the end of 2018 a campaign to end life imprisonment to address the excessive sentencing that dominates the criminal justice system in the United States. And we hope that it contributes to a radical reimagining of criminal justice system responses to law breaking, recognizing people's full humanity, and that they might age out and shouldn't be defined by their crime of conviction that might lead to imprisonment. So one thing that prosecutors can do, and I know there are several progressive prosecutors on this call, is in some states it's possible to revisit some of these excessive sentences that were levied in the 80s and the 90s. And there's some real examples around that. In Wisconsin and Ohio, advocates are reopening cases and are getting individuals who were sentenced 30 or 20 years ago resentenced under new paradigms, new values that dominate sentencing now, rather than dominated sentencing during the tough on crime era of the early 80s and 90s. So acknowledging implicit bias is one step, and then acting on the authority that officials have to revisit some of these tough on crime sentencing laws is another. And the leadership of the folks represented on the call tonight can help make those visions real and put into action ways to repair the harm that have dominated criminal justice system for the last 40 to 50 years, oftentimes with disproportionate impacts on the Black community in particular.
Before you run through the rest of the prosecutors, I apologize. I do want everyone to be aware that I believe these decisions are also thought up at the very part of that, at the very first part. So before we start talking about plea bargaining, we have to talk about when these people are taken off the street, who has made the decision to arrest, who do we actually arrest and put in jail? And the second question is, once we've arrested them and placed them in jail, at first appearance, who do we give a bond to? So those bond decisions are also, I believe, being assessed heavily based on race. In Fulton County, what we are looking at doing, or we have started doing, is working with some national partners to look at our pretrial assessment instrument to remove that bias, to remove the race bias, to remove this is the number of cycles they have, not the number of convictions, not the number of violent crimes, but the number of just cycles. Because I think a lot of what we forget is that simply because you have been arrested does not mean you have been convicted, does not mean that the police, the state, have proven that case when it came time to do so. So a lot of those decisions that come on the front end before we get to the plea bargaining and the power of the state to plea bargain is really based on how long that person has sat in jail. And that's based on whether or not bond is given. And so I want us to remember, it's not just plea bargain and the final sentencing, but it's how we get to that stage.
And I just want to quickly add, I think you can't fix what you can't measure. I think we have to use data and make that data accessible to the public so that you can see, in fact, are you treating people who have been arrested for similar offenses the same? Are we giving the same levels of bond to people in one part of the county versus another part of the county? Are you offering the same plea deals to some as you do to others? I think a lot of this, because the prosecutor's office has so much power, so much discretion, it's also one of the biggest black boxes in the justice system because people don't know how we go about the process of making a plea arrangement. And so most people see the end result. I think it's really important to have data transparency as you look to do the things that we've talked about around looking at implicit bias, because if you don't then have someone to measure against, to be able to have the tough conversations to say, hey, I noticed on domestic violence cases, we offer this in cases where the defendant looks like this, or in these types of cases, why do we actually in fact charge most of our cases in the heart of the city? In some of our suburban, more affluent areas, we don't have any. And some of that may be, well, they don't make those arrests in those parts of the city. That then gives us or the suburbs, an opportunity to say, well, if they don't make those arrests, but we know everyone's using drugs at the same rate, then why are we doing this prosecution model over here? And so I think all of the things that are said are absolutely right. And I think at the core of it, we have to be transparent in the way that we do our work by making that publicly available so that you can then measure against progress. Because people will take classes that you send them to, people will do the things that are like, yes, I'm here, I'm woker, I'm better. But in practice, if we can't measure if in fact we are changing the dynamics of what we're doing, we will always be trying to play catch up.
And I would just add, I mean, you guys covered most of it. I think Kim is right on point when she says that the data is so incredibly important, because before you can even acknowledge that there's an issue, you have to see the data and you have to be presented with the reality of the situation. And so I think that that's incredibly important, the data, the acknowledgement, and then you can actually set the policy as already was stated. You know, that was one of the things that we attempted to do in the city of Baltimore. Now it's 1.5 years ago, when I came out and in essence said that we would not be prosecuting marijuana possession cases any longer in the city of Baltimore. We looked at the data, we understood that there was a disparate sort of impact on poor African-American neighborhoods where these citations were being issued, where they were making arrests. And what we essentially were able to do was to say, I, as a prosecutor, I'm going to use my discretion, and I'm not going to be complicit in the discriminatory enforcement of laws against poor Black and brown people. And when you have that data to support your position, there's really no disputing it. It is what it is. And so I think that that is incredibly important, and that transparency is something that, you know, in this day and age, prosecutors should attempt to do more often.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mosby. I'm actually going to start intermixing the audience questions into our line of questioning. And one we do have is, how do we eliminate cash bail nationally? How do we eliminate cash bail nationally? And that question is for anyone.
So I'll answer that. I mean, the problem is whenever this gets into that states' rights thing, or, you know, that when we have issues that we want to change nationally, we have to work state by state, because every state has their own laws, their own rules, and we don't have a national criminal justice system. We have individual states implementing various different policies and rules that affect the overall criminal justice system. So, you know, what we have to do is continue to work with organizations that are moving from state to state to state to enforce change. And it's a long road. It's not a sprint. It is a marathon. Just as we are with any other criminal justice issue, we have to use our voices and make sure that we are electing leaders, whether it's a district attorney or a governor or a member of your local state house, that are going to be concerned with and advocate for these issues. And it has to be done in each and every community. And it requires an engagement of not just a small group of people, but a large group of people to have these conversations. But it is a long road because it's not just a switch that we can take and pass a law in Congress, and it is not that simple. But I have been really excited to see the number of people that are taking on these very issues and the number of leaders that we're seeing talking about these issues, and more importantly, the number of elected prosecutors that are stepping out and talking about the realities that we need to really address cash bail and what it's been about in our system and what it's been used for, and question the realities of whether it's really keeping our community safe.
I think the interesting thing about cash bail is now that we are in a system of COVID-19, or the pandemic is going around and everyone's wondering how to clear out our jails, those people that we once believed to be dangerous and requiring all sorts of requirements before we let them walk out the door, now we're pushing them out the door before they can even come in the system. And so the question is, if cash bail is not appropriate, and I'm not saying that it is, because I believe cash bail may be appropriate for certain offenses, but it has taken hold in such a way that we have gotten comfortable with it as an end solution. And whether or not that is the appropriate end solution is what we should look at. I believe that there was talk, and I did not follow it, when the city of Atlanta got rid of their cash bail system, they had many people that failed to show up for court. But the question is, did people fail to show up for court because they were not detained, or did people, well, not that, but did people fail to show up for court because they didn't get a notice, like they forgot when they were supposed to be there? There are a lot of practicalities about people not making it to court that we just forget because we live in a very different world. We live in I'm going to my dentist appointment. If I don't get there, he's going to charge me $25. We don't think about that for somebody that's, I got to get on the bus to get where I need to be. And then it seems that systems that should be set up to help are not necessarily set up that way. If I place somebody on a pretrial release system, now the pretrial release system has to make sure that you come back in and check in with them every, like, twice a week or once a week, whatever that is. Now you are getting on the bus in this COVID-related situation and coming back into a system where now you may or may not be passing something on. I think COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to look at what it is we are doing and what we are truly determining bond situation should look like.
Thank you, ladies. I'm actually going to go to another question from the audience, which is, what is the best way for civilians to help change the criminal justice system? They asked for you all to pick one suggestion, and I'm actually going to start with the justice.
Thank you. You know, I think that the first thing that people can do is to get engaged in what's going on in your own communities in the criminal justice system. I often had groups of people come in and watch. This was when I was a trial judge for the state of Washington. Come in and watch the criminal calendar in the morning in my courtroom, which would usually have between 70 and 90 cases that we would hear in 3.5 hours, and then have them come back at 2:30 to watch the drug court calendar that I also presided over. And that experience of seeing a therapeutic court addressing the whole person and all the issues that they brought in versus a criminal court that was just getting through as many cases as we possibly could in a short period of time. That contrast really helped people in the community begin to have a conversation that was an informed conversation about what was actually happening in their local criminal justice system. And from that, there were efforts made towards change that were really based in knowledge about what was going on. And I think that can be a very successful model if people in their own communities really go in and watch what's happening in their courtrooms.
The one piece of advice that I would give for the communities to get engaged is I would encourage people to vote. I can't emphasize this enough. It is incredibly important for you to not only know what's going on in your communities, but local politics is your daily life. It has an impact on your daily life. You need to know who your district attorney is. Why? Because guess what? Look what's happening right now in Minneapolis, right? Like, we look what's happened. We can set policies, but we need you to, I cannot emphasize this enough. Like, we need folks to understand the importance, just not even on a national scale, but on a local scale. And the most fundamental right that you have and the ability that you have to reform the criminal justice system that we know is disparately impacting communities of color is for you to get out here and exercise your fundamental right to vote.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
In addition to the right to vote, I would also say to fill out your census. Every October, whenever it is, I have to go before our Board of Commission and beg for money. It is the Hunger Games, and I feel like Rue. And so I want to tell you all, if we do not have the money to fund these systems, it absolutely makes no difference. And if people are not saying, hey, I live here, we don't get those resources. So one of the things I would say, in addition to voting, absolutely go vote, but fill out your census, because we need to be counted. We need you to be counted so that those dollars will flow to us appropriately.
Thank you, Judge. The next question is, we know that women of color are underrepresented in the judiciary and legal profession as a whole. Black women make up just 1% of the nation's prosecutors. Only 27% of sitting judges are women, per the Center for American Progress. And Justice Montoya-Lewis is only the second Native American judge to serve on a state Supreme Court in U.S. history. What role, if any, does your identity play in your decision-making?
I'm happy to start with that. I think that I think it plays a very significant role, because I think the way that I think, the way I assess problems, the way that I make decisions is often based upon what I understand about the community that I'm working in. You know, I had the opportunity as a tribal court judge to work with different tribes that had different court systems and were able to construct court systems that reflected their own sense of justice. And I brought that with me into the state court system that was a much more rigid kind of a system. And my experience with that was that I continued to use those same skills in terms of thinking about, particularly in criminal justice with criminal cases, to think about, you know, the folks that are in front of me, the vast majority of them were going to be coming back into the community. Most people seem to have the idea that, you know, if somebody's sentenced to prison or jail, they're going to be gone and they're not coming back. That's not the view that I have. My view is that I know they'll be back because I'm sentencing them, and I know they'll be back in 6 months or 6 years. And so I want to think about how those folks are going to reintegrate back into our communities and do that in a way that that supports their continued life, hopefully outside of the criminal justice system. So you know, that is very much a part of my identity, and certainly, you know, in this new role, there's absolutely a different view that I bring to the Supreme Court. And I think that's really important, because I think we have to have a diversity of voices in positions of power like this, because in the absence of that, then the same structures get repeated over and over again.
Thank you.
I'll ditto that. I mean, I think so often we have seen people who have no connection to the communities that they serve dictating policy for those communities and not understanding. I mean, it goes to the point that Marilyn made earlier, where you had like law enforcement who doesn't live in the communities, doesn't know it, can't understand it. It's the same thing, I think, with elected leaders, that if you don't understand the communities and constituencies that you serve, then you may not see the flaws in your policy. It's why when you ask, like, who am I at 14, and I talk about my mother and grandmother, the fact that less than 1% of elected prosecutors look like them, and yet the implications of prosecution and criminal justice has a profound impact on the communities that my grandmother and mother raised me in. To come into these roles and to act agnostic about it does a disservice, right? It is a disservice. So I think for me, I wear the fact that I am a Black woman from public housing in everything that I do, right? I don't get to like take some parts of it off. And particularly when you're talking about communities that have been marginalized, right? Where people are like, I just want a seat at the table. It's not about a seat at the table. It's about like setting the menu. You know, I use it back once upon a time when we used to could go out and eat. You know, I had a friend who, you know, every time she ordered something, she like altered her meal. Like the omelet that came with cheese, I don't want cheese, I want this, I want that. And it would be absolutely annoying, but it was tailored to what she wanted. And I think about so often that I would eat something that had something on it that I didn't want because I didn't want to shake things up. I didn't want to make anybody mad. And it ended up hurting my stomach later. And so that's how I view this work, is that it's okay to tailor things for communities that have been left behind. In fact, they are counting on you to do that. They are counting on you to know that lived experience, to know what has been absent from the conversation, and to be unafraid to say it without fear of, oh no, I'm being disruptive. Because I think we've gotten so much horrible failed criminal justice policy that has impacted Black and brown communities in the way that it has, because for so long we weren't at the table with people with lived experiences saying, no, that's harmful. And so I just want to encourage particularly young women who get into these spaces to not minimize that aspect of who you are, that diversity of experience from your community, your neighborhood, your race, your gender is absolutely what we need right now. And to be unapologetic about how it impacts how you make your decisions.
Thank you. Kirk, did you have a remark?
So I did. I was going to say that I'd like to believe that once I get on the bench that I am able to separate me as a Black woman from the life that I am about to irretrievably interrupt. But I have to say that what I realized when I came to the juvenile court bench, because that's where I first came, is that a lot of us that work in the system just do system work. We talk in these acronyms that we are very familiar with. And what I realized was when I got on the bench, I wanted to be able to say to them, this is the bench. This is what we're doing. These are the things I'm going to be looking for. You know, parent, do you understand? Child, do you understand? Are there questions for me before we get started? And for me, it's a matter of just individualizing and being able to see those people. It's not going to change procedurally what I do, but for me, making sure that they are aware of what this process is. We are not going to run them through the process because the state has 15 cases on the calendar that day, not my issue. I want to make sure that for each of the cases that comes before me, that they know why they're here and what we're going to do today. At the end of that, I'm going to make a ruling. They might not get the written ruling until later, but they will get the ruling, and I will explain to them what it is I have done and that they will get a copy of it. That's the first thing. The other thing is I realized that as an elected leader, I have the responsibility of appointing other judges. And part of that is making sure that those judges are going to care for the communities that we live in. Not that those judges are going to coddle one person or the other, but they are going to be fair no matter what the people that look like them, no matter what the people that come before them look like. We have a very diverse bench, and I am very proud of that. I'm very proud of the judges that I have serving with me, because I believe in them. I believe that they will be fair and honest, whether I'm sitting there, whether I'm not sitting there. I have seen them and I have seen their character. Part of who I pick to be a judge is those people that are already serving in their community. So I already know people that have a connection, And so that gives me comfort to know that they're going to do the right thing, regardless of who the people are in front of them.
Thank you so much. I actually, we are over time, and we do have 1.5 meaty question that is criminal justice oriented. But there is one, or actually a few questions from the audience that I do want to tap into, because we are trying to provide as much information to the ladies as possible. We have a number of new prosecutors and actually law students, female law students watching now, and they want to know, what advice would you give to new prosecutors that want to get into your line of work, taking your direction to this specialty in the criminal justice field? Anyone can jump in.
I'll go. So I want to say, first, get your financial house in order. If you are planning to work in a public service field, understand that these are not high-paying jobs. You see friends that are going to go work at firms and they're going to make $115,000 their first year. That won't be you. My first job as a prosecutor, I made $30,000. I left the firm because I was like, I want to go prosecute. I want to be in court. And the prosecutor that I was there, I went to the Newton County DA's office, which is in kind of East Georgia, and he said, the salary is $30,000. I was like that's a year? And so that was the salary. So I need people that are believing that they are going in criminal justice in these public service fields to understand, get your financial house in order, however that looks. If there are loans or not loans, but if you have loan forgiveness programs that you can work, get in those early enough. I did not get in mine early enough, but while your career will be incredibly fulfilling, you will not become rich doing this the ethical way.
Anyone else? I see the last is agreement, I'm assuming.
I guess I would add that you really should think, and I say this to most young people, it's not about your instant gratification. As the judge just indicated, when you go into public service, this is more of a calling, right? You don't do it for the money. And if you're thinking about instant gratification, like this is not the job for you, you should always think long-term. And one of the things that I attempted to do in understanding and recognizing that I was not going into this for the money was that I tried to diversify my experience as much as possible, humanly possible. You know, when I was in law school, I interned where my friends and colleagues were getting $40,000 a summer, right? Like I wasn't. I was interning and volunteering for the U.S. the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston and in D.C., Suffolk County Homicide Unit. Then I was doing clinicals and trying to diversify my experience. So I was a student defense attorney for a year. And so I wanted to make myself that much more marketable. Understanding I was looking and going towards prosecution, I wanted to make sure that I had a well-rounded perspective. So I wanted the defense perspective, right? So I would just encourage you to think long-term, make yourself marketable. And one of the things that I can say, I came out making, I think it was $50,000, which was rather competitive in the world of public service and prosecution around the country at that time, right? Now, my mom always told me, don't do things, you go follow your passion, don't do it for money. And money, if you do what you love to do and you're passionate about it, money will come. So I can just say, I would encourage you to not only think long-term, but to even consider getting in and running for office and not just being a prosecutor in someone else's office. You know, as was already indicated, we represent as Black women 1% of all elected prosecutors in the country. Prosecutors are the ones who decide who's going to be charged with, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations that we're going to make, right? We're one of the most important stakeholders in the criminal justice system. But we need you to be at the table, setting the menu, as my colleague so eloquently stated, but also thinking long-term, right? Like I did all of that volunteering, and now I can say that I'm one of the highest paid elected officials in the state of Maryland. It was, again, long-term that I was thinking about, and that's what I would encourage you to do.
So I would say, don't be afraid to pivot and change, and never say never. Because I didn't set out to be a prosecutor. In fact, I specifically said as I was coming out of law school that being a prosecutor is something I never wanted to be. And I spent the first 12 years of my career doing criminal defense. And if you asked me in my third year in law school, if I thought I'd be sitting here 20 plus years later as the elected prosecutor in the county where I went to law school. I would have laughed at you. I mean, literally. But I got to where I got because I had people in my life that suggested that the change that I wanted to make, that the concerns that I had about the community and the people that I was representing, that I might be better suited in this elected leadership role. I took that advice begrudgingly. I was not a person that actually was just like, yeah, you're right. No, I was absolutely like, no, I don't see it. But in that moment, I allowed someone else to see it for me. And once I realized that, then I took off those blinders and said, I need to start seeing things in a different way. I need to start challenging what I want to do and how I want to do things. And I can't just put myself in a box and say, no, never. That would never be me, or I never want to do that, or that's not what I'm supposed to do. And since that time, I have watched myself really see all that I could possibly do or be within my community just by lifting off the weight and the blinders that come with being open to opportunity, wherever that takes you. And so that's what I would suggest coming out of law school. Be open to opportunity, never say never, and don't box yourself into one choice, because there are many roads and paths that may lead you to what you're meant to be doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. Now, the last meaty question we have, what do you perceive to be as the greatest challenge for individuals reintegrating into society? What can be done to overcome these challenges?
Well, I mean, the research tells us housing and employment are key issues for people reentering either from prison or from jail. I'll just say that, the United States has narrowed many of its public safety programs over the last 30 to 40 years. But one area of public infrastructure that's grown has been the criminal justice system, and a great deal of resources have been devoted to prisons and jails and other parts of the criminal justice system. So in meeting the needs of people exiting prison and jail, we really need to be organizing around resources that can be dedicated to housing, rapid rehousing for people who may not have family to return to, jobs programs that can meet people's material needs and reduce their likelihood of returning back to prisons or jails. So those are some of the key issues, housing and employment. And there are a range of others, but if we can tackle those, including fully funding initiatives at the local and state level, we can help reduce returns to prison.
Thank you so much.
I would agree with that. And it's why I think this time that we're in now is going to be particularly challenging, and we need to really double down on our investment in people who are coming back with COVID-19 and the unemployment rates that we're seeing already. Where, jobs and housing and all of those things are going to be particularly fragile, will be even more so in the coming months. And those who come back into the community, having done their time, are now going to be competing for jobs that they were already, struggling to get, because people who donate against those who have a record, or maybe they've been gone for so long that as technology emerges and changes, you're moving into a new environment, are now competing with people who are back into the workforce again. And I think we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we're being charitable by investing in these resources for folks who are returning. Why should we help them? They've done something wrong. What we know is that we can cut down on recidivism when people who come out of the prison system are able to be employed and meaningfully contribute to the communities, if they have stable housing. These aren't people who cycle in and out of the system simply because they are bad people who haven't learned. People will do what they need to do to be able to survive. And so there's an incentive to make sure that their survival is secured by having access to jobs, having access to housing, having access to education. And even in fragile economic times like we are in right now, we cannot lose sight of that. I go back to what I said earlier, healthy, thriving communities tend to have less crime. People who are coming out of penal institutions are going back to the same neighborhoods that they left. We have to invest in them, in their neighborhoods, and the structures around them so that we can see a diminishment in crime and those people can contribute to our communities. But my fear right now with everything with COVID-19 and the disruption of our economies and this feeling of scarcity is that people will retreat from wanting to invest in that, not looking, as Marilyn would say, at the long game. The long game requires us to invest in jobs, housing, mental and physical health for those who are coming back into our communities.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies. So I did want to say before we got off, the viewers that are not used to having this type of panel all at once, they are saying thank you so much for your good information and the guidance you have provided. And they're throwing up prayer hands. And to close out, and it could be 60 seconds or less, because I know we've touched on a lot of the advice that you would give young women pursuing this career in a public service. But share one piece of advice for young women who are considering careers in public service. And I'll start with the justice.
It's a great question. And, you know, I think that the best piece of advice I got was from a justice that I was clerking for after law school. And it continues to be a really important piece of advice for me. And she said that she had had kids while she was, you know, mid-career. And she said that she wished, now that her kids were older, that when she was at work, she was just at work and she focused on work and didn't feel bad about not being at home. And when she was at home, she wished that she had just focused on home and didn't feel bad that she wasn't working. And she encouraged me to focus on work when I was at work and to set boundaries around work when I was at home. I certainly didn't execute that perfectly by any stretch, but I think it's really important because these are demanding jobs and the work will always be there. You can work 80 hours a week and still have the work there. To be, if you're someone who wants to have a family, that you set those boundaries around what you do for the time you spend at work and the time that you spend at home, and try to protect both of those things. I think it is a really, a career in law is incredibly rewarding, but I think we have to be honest that it's also incredibly demanding. And I think we have to support each other as women in recognizing that balancing those things is really difficult. And I think balancing is kind of a misnomer. I don't know that there's really a way to balance, but there is a way to do everything. And you know, I just encourage people to really give yourself a break so that you're not just overcome with feeling like you should be doing something else when you're doing whatever the thing is that you're at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicole Porter.
I'll just add that I think there are clearly strong women on this panel to learn from, and there may be other women out there that folks wanting to get involved in public service can learn from, reading their memoirs, reading any articles that highlight their career directories. I think it's also okay if your personal experiences don't map on to anyone in public life that you're learning about right now, and to be confident in the possibility that you can chart your own path. Maybe pull from the experiences of some of the women on the panel here tonight, or other public, you know, other women with public lives, but to also know that maybe you're creating something new, and we want to be learning from you and hearing from you at some point in the short term, but also in the long term as well.
Nice, thank you. Judge Kirk.
I would say ask why you're here. I went to law school with some people who are no longer practicing law because they realized that they were doing it simply because it was part of somebody else's path. And so I believe when they started practicing law, it became like they were calling it in. And I'm sure you all have seen prosecutors and defense attorneys who look like they're presently there. And when they get home, they tell their dog what it is they did, but what they did in court was clearly not represent anybody. They didn't represent their client, and they didn't represent the state if that was their job. And so I would say that if you are going to do a public service job, do that job. The people there are depending on you. So for me, I've got a career doing a lot of different things. Like Miss Mosby, I have varied my experience. I changed jobs every 2 years when I was first starting out because I wanted to be able to sit on all sides of the courtroom. And I can tell you that there were attorneys who really, really pulled their weight every single day in court. And it was an honor to be in court with them. But there were attorneys I knew who were just calling it in. Were physically sitting in the chair, but really we're not making appropriate arguments for their client. We're not making appropriate arguments to the bench. I think they do a bigger disservice there. That's the first thing. The second thing is spend an hour learning to be an expert in something, whether that is trial skills, whether that is, I'm a CWLS, whether that is teacher training techniques, whatever it is, spend an hour a night so that you will be an expert in something. It is important to be able to distinguish yourself when you get to these roles. Currently, I am taking courses at the National Center for State Courts because I am also the court administrator for my court. And so I am continuing to take courses. I would say that to anyone in a law role, not just that CLE you have to take, but take something that's going to improve you so that when you go into the workplace, you can talk with others about best practices because you have read them and you have studied them and you are able to add something to that conversation.
Thank you, Judge. Kim Foxx.
Thank you. I would echo the advice that has already been given. I would say a couple things, even in whatever it is that you're doing, stay civically engaged. There's the job that you do. And with the job, be excellent. It is, I can't tell you how many people who come to me and say, what advice do you have? Be good at the job that you have. Right? Whatever it is that you're doing, be good. I think we are so caught up in like the showiness of the job, like the every other Friday, like, ooh. But people stand up and stand out when they are good at what they do. And that does require you to do an investment in the work. It requires you sometimes to stay late at work, which is why it's hard to balance. But now we're at home and staying late might be like staying in your living room a little bit longer. But be excellent. It is really hard to have conversations with people who want to be promoted and first thing I do is I pull out, that evaluation and who are you? What have you done? So excellence is the minimum. Excellence is the minimum in any job that you do. And it's the minimum. The civic piece is, I think I grew in my career. I was a prosecutor for 12 years in the office that I now run, but I did some board work. I found things that I cared about and joined the boards of a couple of non-for-profits just so I can meet people who weren't lawyers, so I could meet people who were dedicated to other things. I learned about fundraising. I learned about balancing books. I learned about engagement. All things that I would normally not do in the work that I was doing in the office, that really helped me build a broader network. I think you always want to expand your network. If we have a tendency to hang out with people who are just like us. And so I have a lot of Black women lawyer friends because that's what I hung around with. You want a broad network so that when opportunities come, whether it's in prosecution or not, you can be able to tap into other people that Your bar associations are good, but do something outside of even that brings you joy and fulfillment, and teaches you leadership skills that maybe you're low on the totem pole in your unit, but as you're working on a board or a junior board or whatever, you're getting skills, leadership skills that you may be able to bring back to the work that you're doing. I think one of the biggest things that changed my entire career, I did a program called Leadership Greater Chicago when I was a young assistant, and I met private attorneys, I met corporate folks, I met nonprofit folks, and I just soaked up everything that they had to bear and used that in the work that I was doing in government work. So expand your network, do things that bring you joy. If you do public service, oftentimes it's incredibly thankless. If you are Marilyn and Sherry are super hard. If you are leading an office, it is the most thankless. And you will have to remember your why, the why you do it, as the judge said, but also find things that bring you joy. And last thing, as the justice said, the balancing, disabuse yourself of the notion of having it all. You don't have it all at once. And it's not always neat. It's oftentimes messy. And if you're someone who clings to, order and things must be, let that go. But always at the center and heart of it, be on mission, and be excellent in everything you do.
Thank you so much, Honorable Sherry Boston.
And my last, can I just say ditto to everything that these wonderful women have said? Public service is just that. It really is a service. And it is a weight that can weigh on you in ways that if at the end of the day, you can't come home and say, I'm doing this because I'm committed to making a difference, then it will weigh you out of this position, or any of these positions, because campaigning is not fun. Politics is even worse. Managing hundreds of people in the office, all of these things that often come with public service or being in an elected role, are a lot. And so at the end of the day, when you come home and you get into bed, you have to be willing to say, my heart has called me to do this. For me, it's God has led me on this path for a reason. And maybe I haven't fulfilled or realized that reason yet. I don't know. But I stay on the path because I feel like I'm being pulled in a way that at some point in my life, it will be revealed to me, that I have accomplished the mission that I was set out, that someone else set out for me. It's not my mission. I realized that a long time ago, that it's not my mission, and I'm just going to follow it because someone else has carved it out for me. And I feel like that's really what true public service is about, because you're not doing it for your own gain. You're not doing it to climb. I mean, there are plenty of people that do, but if you really, really are invested in being a good public servant, then you're going to follow that mission to whatever end, and know that if you do that, and I love my friend Kim saying, be excellent, be excellent, be excellent. I love that because it's so true. In my office, I like to say, with my team, we are not #basic. We are not basic. And we always say you can't do epic, I'll just say, things with basic people. You can't. And you can substitute the things for whatever word you want to put in there on your t-shirt that I might have in my closet. But at the end of the day, that's what true public service is about.
Thank you so much. And to close it out, Honorable Marilyn Mosby.
So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you again for even thinking of me and allowing me to be on this esteemed panel. I have learned so much about each and every one of you, and not the ones I already know, but everybody else. And I just appreciate the opportunity to be here and to give advice, or to even be sought for advice. I think what my colleagues have already indicated, do what brings you joy. As Kim had indicated, I think Sherry touched upon being rooted in faith, understanding and recognizing that, it's bigger than you. And he's giving you a story, but really a testimony. It's the story of your life may change a chapter in somebody else's life, and understanding that it's not even about you. It's greater than you. When I've gone through some of my toughest times, they're laughing because I do this and I say this to them all the time, right? It's at the end of the day, it's not even about us individually. It's about what we represent for our communities and bedrock of our communities. We are the lifeline of our communities. We're the mothers, the aunts, the sisters, the grandmothers, the wives. And as I started this before, our husbands, our sons, our brothers are being killed and being slaughtered each and every day. This criminal justice system is disproportionately impacting them. And so, yes, we need you at the table. We need you to step up and to assist. And so that it's not just 1% of all elected prosecutors in these types of forums. And so the last piece of advice I would just say is that once you've arrived where God has placed you, right, give back and ensure that you're pulling others up, right? And be unapologetically bold, beautiful, and brilliant. And yes, be excellent.
Very nice. Thank you, ladies. To conclude, thank you, ladies, for joining us. It is truly an honor, and I definitely want to state we do not take it lightly that you all cleared your schedule for this opportunity. We're definitely humbled. We do not take it lightly. We definitely understand your workloads. On behalf of CLA, the United States of Women, thank you for partnering with us. And just in general, one more thing, some of the law students have asked about posting mentoring programs, recommendations from you all. We're going to ask them to do that offline so we can close out, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledge you. But on behalf of CLA, our board, the United States of Women, we want to say thank you. And the time for equality is always, always, always right now. Thank you and good night.